Hey everybody, thanks for showing up. I know we just had a break, so I managed to not kill myself on the 3 steps, so I think we're all good. Hello everyone. My name is Juan Andrés Guerrero Sade, which I did not expect anyone to try to pronounce. Jags is fine. And I really didn't expect to speak at S4. I'm traditionally on the sort of threat hunting, APT side of the house, and while streams cross from time to time, usually ICS isn't my jam. I'm interested, but it really isn't my area of specialty. However, with everything that's been going on, actually in the past, I want to say year, 8 months, not specific to Ukraine, but really how some actors are evolving and how some effects are becoming more popular, more often we're starting to run into things that actually sort of cross that boundary into your space. So hopefully we can have sort of an interesting discussion about the threat actors involved, some of the tactics that are sort of changing around this, in particular with Ukraine, and then where it starts to kind of cross the boundary into what you guys do. Now, I think it's kind of important to take a minute just because we're all kind of making marketing hay out of the Ukraine crisis, but I think it's important that while we talk about our bears and we talk about our fancy threat actors and our great names, it's nice to be able to make light of a difficult situation, at least in this space. But there is a real crisis out there, an actual situation that people are suffering through a war, an unwarranted invasion, and I think it's nice to take a minute to just kind of let that sink in instead of just sort of rushing along. You can see sort of the folks at UA Cert or Cert UA sort of working at a breakneck speed trying to figure this stuff out. And the best we can do is kind of support them. In that same sort of spirit, while I'm about to commit the cardinal sin of product marketing, which is we obviously didn't do this work alone. If anything, we've done a fraction of this sort of research work. So I think it's important to take a minute and actually acknowledge sort of all the people that have been working on this, from ESET to Mandiant to Mystic, CISA, Cyber Command, Talos, everybody that, of course, Cert UA, that have sort of been contributing in ways big and small, and a lot of trust groups of people that cannot be named and are not looking for a victory lap, who are contributing to this research every day and sort of doing their best, especially since the invasion started, to kind of stay ahead of this. The truth is that there's way more cyber activity than we are seeing, and there's definitely way more than we can actually process in any meaningful way. So if there's one positive aspect of all of this, is I think it has brought the threat intelligence industry back to a collaborative space that I don't think we've been in for 10 years, because it's just gotten so adversarial. So this is the menagerie as it stands as far as the Ukrainian space, starting with January, essentially. So tons and tons of naming overlaps. All the UACs, of course, are what Cert UA is sort of calling these things. We've tried to name some things along the way. We have some groups that we're already known, like Gamma and Ghost Rider. And it's not all Russia, right? You've got presumably Belarus and a pretty interesting old school Chinese threat actor that, to be perfectly honest with you, I had to Google for because I didn't even know about them. But this is us kind of trying to put a lot of stuff into perspective. And it's actually why, I've been trying to keep up with this, and it's been fairly difficult. So I figure other folks can kind of help from some of the parsing. And you can see this is already outdated, right? We're going to talk about Caddy Wiper. There's more happening on the Sandworm umbrella. But that happened in the past week. So just in the past 2 weeks, we can kind of take a little bit more of this and put it into place, sort of where it should be. And I think it speaks to how complicated all this is, how bad our visibility generally is, but also just how overwhelmed I think we are as analysts in trying to figure out what's going on. So while I would love to chew the whole thing, I think at this point we're just going to funnel into just focusing on wipers. So just since January, we've seen 6 Windows wipers. Whisper Kill, Whispergate happened in January. Then, as Robert Lipovsky described earlier, you had Hermetic Wiper kind of kicking off the invasion. It was about 6-7 hours before the invasion actually started. Hermetic Wiper becomes a thing that we're all aware of. Symantec and ESET kind of breaking ground there. And At the time, we didn't know how it spread. We didn't know, exactly where it was going. Then, I think 4 days, 5 days later, we get ISIC wiper, caddy wiper completely decontextualized, and 00 wiper, something that cert UA finds in the wild. Then you've got these three Linux, Unix, Solaris wipers. It's kind of funny to call them that. If you were here for the Indestroyer 2 talk, like, they're three scripts. I mean, there's a discussion to be had about the security of Linux systems, but that's not in the scope of this talk. But yeah, three scripts that were enough to kind of do this wiping. And then you have sort of the router, modem, IoT side of the house, which, we're going to talk about AcidRain. It's sort of like the focus that kind of wraps it all up. But I add some question marks there because we have reports of other attacks that involve things at telcos, ISPs, and power plants, even as part of sort of the Indestroyer report, that we haven't been able to find the components for. So what I'm trying to do is really just paint a very spotty picture, and trying to be as honest about all the things that we're still ignorant of, to be perfectly frank. By the way, the timer never kicked off, so you might have to, wrangle me. So why so many wipers? I think in reality, it's not that there are so many wipers as much as it's a reflection of the breadth of activity that's really happening and the fact that the wipers are kind of the closing out part of that chain that is obviously meant to be visible, right? If you're disabling the system, you've gotten to the point where you're causing an effect where there's no ambiguity about the fact that there was an attack. If anything, we can talk about how the threat actors have evolved in order to make wipers sort of like a necessary or desirable aspect of sort of like the end of their campaigns. And there's a ton of them, right? Like wipers, for folks that don't necessarily track threat actors like nation state stuff, wipers are relatively rare. It's a tool that has a lot more, you have a lot more to lose at that point in your campaign, right? You're basically letting the victim know that you've been there, losing your access, and letting them know that they should probably do better all at once. And normally that's an undesirable thing. So I would normally I've been referring to this now as like a telemetrical fog of war. And that's to say that we are not seeing most of what's happening in Ukraine. And I think we need to be really honest with ourselves on that front. I think it's also why I think we need to bear hug Microsoft, ESET, and Cert UA for the work that they're doing, because if it weren't for them, I think for the most part we would be missing most of this activity, and we're probably missing the bulk of the iceberg. So before we go patting ourselves on the back on all the amazing work we've done and all the great findings we have, I think we need to be a little honest and admit that we're really not seeing the majority of it. That's why the wipers are so significant in the sense that we're seeing the attacks that were basically meant to be seen, and we're definitely missing out on a ton of espionage, recon, and just things that sort of fall beneath the threshold of what's discrete, non-discrete. So I want to kind of maximize what we're learning on the basis of that. We drew this sort of threat actor map earlier. And those threat actors, in some ways, we can't correlate some of them to the ones we already knew. Some of them might be new. Some of them might, are presumed from other countries that we're not as familiar with. But generally, there's just sort of this cloud of activity that we're having a very hard time parsing. So if you think about caddy wiper, which, again, Robert Lipovsky talked about earlier today, caddy wiper was first discovered in a decontextualized manner. That's kind of the beauty of things like VirusTotal and other systems that are sort of generally collecting samples, is you get a snapshot of a bunch of files, but you don't necessarily know where it came from, how it got there, why you have it, et cetera, and it makes it a lot harder to kind of understand what part it plays in an attack chain. So now, caddy wiper was discovered a month ago. As of 4 days ago, we now know that caddy wiper is an essential part of what, Sandworm, in some incarnation, in some form, is using as part of their deployment strategy, as part of their cleanup strategy, as part of, just making life a little bit harder for the folks that are trying to bring systems back up. And I bring that more as an illustrative point of the value that comes with having a little more time, maybe holding off on the hot takes, maybe not rushing to write your Washington Post op-ed just yet, and kind of trying to figure out what's actually happening, right? Blatantly stolen from ESET, just for the sake of illustration, right? You have your Indestroyer and caddy wiper, obviously particularly relevant to folks here. For the ICS network, And then just the presence of these, org shred, solo shred, awful shred, whatever you want to call them, sort of wiper scripts for Linux and Solaris, it kind of goes to show sort of the breadth of the toolkit, specifically for the purpose of, everything has to go down, and that's it. It really doesn't, I don't think that there's a kind of a grand unified theory of ops here, as much as you're saying, this has to be as painful and inconvenient and difficult to bring up as possible, and that's why we're seeing what, at this point, 10, 11 custom wipers that are kind of being pulled into this. It plays an essential part in this type of operation that we're very unfamiliar with in an actual conflict. So hermetic wiper, I think, a lot of folks are already familiar with a lot of the components, but hermetic wiper really kind of kicks us off. The reason we named it hermetic wiper is it's digitally signed with a digital certificate by a company called Hermetica Digital. These poor guys in Cyprus had no idea this was happening. They have a normal software company, and all of a sudden, they're in the midst of, this kind of hybrid conflict. So somebody used their company name to issue a certificate. Good luck trying to get the certificate authorities to tell you anything about that. And it's also a technique that ransomware actors have been using recently. But in any case, I think it's important to point this out as sort of hermetic wiper as the start of it all, because not only does it show us the operational tempo kind of increasing as the invasion is happening, but it also brings us to an interesting kind of conceptual tidbit. If you look at the code, it's calling out to this device, EPMNT drive, which is actually a benign driver for partition management for a product called ESUS Partition Master. I think it's sort of notable in the sense that the Russians have finally embraced the Shamoon school of wiping, which is also the Destover school of wiping, which is to say, when the Iranians decided to get into the wiping space, they figured out, hey, if you just steal a driver for partition management, it makes this a lot easier. And then the North Koreans said, hey, that seemed to work out well, and then they take the same driver and they do that as well. And now, for the first time, we're seeing the Russians kind of take that lazy way out and decide to abuse a legitimate product. Another aspect of this that was mentioned in the earlier ESA talk is Hermetic Wizard, which I think is notable in that if we're going to talk about NotPetya and Sandworm and so on, there's an interesting distinction here in seeing wipers that have been decoupled from their spreading mechanism. I think for a lot of folks, the distinction with NotPetya on an easy level is, well, you don't have eternal blue to make it easy for you. But the true power of NotPetya's spreading mechanism was really just Mimikatz, WMI, PSXX. So there's really nothing keeping them from doing that again. They just chose not to. And interestingly, even with Romance DLL being the name of the embedded SMB spreader in Hermetic Wizard, it actually isn't an implementation of Eternal Romance. It's just a funny name for them. So should we say that they're restrained? Should we say that they've learned? Should we say that they were trying to not spill out of the bounds of Ukraine? I mean, maybe, but before we start really giving them accolades on that front, I think that there's an obvious failure in the opposite direction. And that's sort of where I think this kind of crosses into a more interesting or more relevant discussion for S4, which is the attacks on sort of the telecommunications sector. There have been tons. Right? If we can talk about, there's all kinds of failures of sort of the Russian military in the midst of this ridiculous attempt of theirs, but one of the most glaring was really that they've let the Ukrainians lead an unbelievable information warfare campaign in the West. They have, essentially, the Ukrainians are doing a fantastic job promoting the kind of material that makes us empathetic, that makes us realize what's going on, that makes us care about this conflict, and it's to their credit, but I think it also speaks to the failure of Russian ops that you wouldn't somehow manage to get Zelensky off of TikTok and Instagram, that you wouldn't be able to keep these folks off the internet. There's a variety of reasons why I think they couldn't, their own comms suck, they kind of needed to rely on some of this stuff. But they've definitely been trying with increasing frequency over the past month or so, where you see attacks on Uker Telecom and Trial Land. They take them down for 6 hours, 12 hours. Some of it is just DDoS, some of it is more targeted. We definitely don't have a lot of details for a lot of them, but it's there. And then there's sort of this glaring side of it, which is the Viasat, Starlink, sort of satellite comms aspect of this. And that's where, until in Destroyer 2 came around, I would say the most significant attack of the invasion happened, right? I will cede that ground to in Destroyer 2, no questions asked. But there is something there that we need to talk about. And that's, I mean, if you note the date on this article, February 28th, right at the beginning of the invasion, people start talking about this satellite outage that knocks out thousands of Enercon's wind turbines in Germany. It's notable because I remember everything that we've been talking about with telemetrical fog of war and how little we know about stuff in Ukraine. If this hadn't happened, I don't think that we would have been aware of the attack on Viasat, well, on the Viasat modems, and even naming it that is a little unfair on Viasat. So let's kind of cut to there, right? So people started freaking out. We finally, we've been preparing for this. No, not quite cyber war, not quite Article 5 nonsense, but there is something to be said about sort of the failure of that attack. So I'm kind of skirting around this, right? What really happened here is it looks like in the midst of the invasion, someone decided to attack these satellite modems that we're told the Ukrainian military relies on for command and control, for control of drones, for a certain level of communications in the field. Now we know those same modems are actually evaluated for use in the field by the US military as well, right? So it's the kind of thing that, like, you pitch a tent somewhere and you need internet and you get a Surfbeam Pro, and that's how you get your internet. And I think to some extent, in the Russian military thinking, it made sense to kind of take this stuff down and cripple that command and control capability on the Ukrainian side. The real issue is that when they did that, they also took down these turbines, because it turns out that, I guess, they didn't have the kind of granular control that you would expect. So there's this great reverser researcher, Ruben Santa Marta, I want to believe his name is, reverse mode, super nice guy if you ever want to reach out to him. And he took the time to actually dump out the firmware from a normal Surfbeam 2 modem and then from a wiped one. And it might be a little bit difficult to tell the difference here, but we'll zoom in a little bit. But you can obviously see that things have changed inside of the modem, right? It's not the same modem as before. And that's where we kind of get into like a weird situation with Viasat's corporate comms, because I think, we know that they have an incident response company, and we know they're taking this seriously, we know they're trying to figure out what's going on, but the early communications that we start to get from them are things like, the attackers got into the management part of the network, and then that network access that was used to execute legitimate targeted management commands on a large number of residential modems simultaneously. I don't know how to parse this statement in a way that kind of reconciles the two realities. Like, you see a modem that's been like wiped completely, and then it's like, well, it's just legitimate commands, and like, we should either discuss what those legitimate commands are, or something's not quite fitting. So as part of that comms, we actually get a kind of disambiguation that I think we need to get into to be fair to Viasat, which is that it really wasn't Viasat. Viasat bought a company, and that company was being managed by an Italian company in the transition. We don't know the timing, whatever. But in any case, it's kind of like a downstream subsidiary attack, and Viasat kind of inherits the bad PR. So, apologies to them. Now, where it gets interesting for me in the sort of the hunting space is about a week before hearing about this, about a week before we got a hit on one of our traps, rules, whatever you want to call them. But we've been looking for this since the end of February, where you go, there was an attack on some kind of modems somewhere in Europe. No, it hasn't really been seen before. What can you craft from that? And for folks that don't play around enough with VirusTotal, there's really all kinds of magical things you can do. And I would love to pretend that it's like galaxy brain thinking, but it really isn't. It's like you sit there and you go, well, it's probably going to be a MIPS binary or a script. So, you go tag script or, magic MIPS. And then it's like, well, it only appeared after February, so first seen February, later than that. And then it's so rare, so maybe less than 3 submissions, so that's 3 minus. And then you start fiddling with the results, and you're like, what are the chances that the letters UKR are a part of the name? And there's one binary. I want to pretend that I'm a galaxy brain genius in hunting, but I'm not. And we just kind of kept fiddling with this thing. Eventually, we put it into auto queries, and this thing pops out. So about a week earlier, we had the sample, and to be perfectly honest, the things that kind of hit us weird is we'd never seen it before, it has this funny name, which you can parse as Ukraine operation, but in reality, I'm pretty sure it's Ukrop, which is like a kind of condescending racial slur that Russians use against Ukrainians. So I don't know, or parsley, whichever way you want to take the term. And we had the binary, and we're really, we'd been messing with it, but we weren't going to come out with any of it until that Viasat statement came out. And we were like, okay, something's not squaring away here, right? Like, whoever's doing their IR is not in a position to talk, but we have this sample, this looks weird, let's figure out kind of what's going on. So as I was saying, you see this, you've got 32-bit MIPS executable, first submitted in mid-March from Italy, which, if you remember, sort of the Italian subsidiary. You have this thing, which I don't expect any of you to be able to parse, but then that's when I enlist Max van Amerongen, who is a brilliant vulnerability researcher and reverser, 10 times better than I'll ever be, and he gets us something a little more readable, a little more understandable. So this is where we introduce AcidRain. Obviously, we wanted sort of this imagery of stuff falling from the sky and making everything terrible. And that's AcidRain. AcidRain basically recurses through all of these normal Linux paths, trying to figure out everything that's there, recursively deleting all these directories. It then does the same for these sort of generic block devices, SD cards, files, device files for flash memory, basically every possible type of device that you could have in one of these embedded Linux systems. It'll go through and wipe all of them, and it'll wipe them in one of two ways, depending on whether it is root or not. And both of them are worth diving into a little bit. So the first one is this, and this is sort of like the simplest wiping mechanism. You basically create this FFFFFFFF value, and then you decrement by 1, and you write that, and then you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going. And why is that significant? It's if I'm being honest with you, we talked about VT, right? I've got this sample, I think it's the thing, but how do I know that it relates to this particular attack? Well, we go back to Ruben's tweet. And Ruben was kind enough to share sort of the dump of the firmware. I'm happy to share it with anybody else. But frankly, this is what the entire post-wiping device looks like. FFFFF E3, FFFFF E2, FFFFF. You have the same decrementing counter. And for us, that's kind of what ended up linking AcidRain to this particular attack, despite the original statement. And then, to Viasat's credit, they were very quick to basically say, yeah, they're right, which still doesn't really square the statement with the existence of the wiper, but we'll take it, right? Thank you, Viasat. We'll take it as some confirmation of what we're seeing. Now, going back to these, right? We already went through one of the types of wiping, which I think is significant. Now let's go through the other one in what little time we have left. So, why am I bringing this up? Well, for any reversers out there, people who are really into this, right? You have these ioctls that are being used for the wiping mechanism. And it's relatively simple. Mem get info, mem unlock, mem erase, right? This is just a different way that you're going to try to wipe devices. If you look on the other side, you have a very similar mechanism. Mem get info, mem unlock, mem erase, mem get info, mem unlock, mem write. Relatively rare, shared, but the difference here is that one of them is AcidRain, and the other one is a plugin called DSTR or Destroy or whatever you want to call it. And what makes it notable is that it's a VPN filter stage 3 plugin. So for anybody who remembers VPN filter, it was this sort of sizable story all on its own, really interesting sort of Soho router malware, but also very specific Soho malware router. When you look at all the plugins, they're kind of hard-coded in ways that they're only going to affect certain kinds of devices. Part of what makes this notable is you have this code connection of I want to say 56% code similarity between the two, and you see sort of the device destruction module implementing a fairly similar logic, though not quite the same as far as what it's wiping. And this is the point at which people go, okay, you have the attribution smoking gun. Are they the same? And it's no, they're let's not go there. That's not quite where we're at. if we're being intellectually honest. What we can say is they share a similar development environment. They've gone about doing things the same way. You have statically linked libc, you have similar wiping techniques for both of them, you have the same compiler to the point where the section header strings table is exactly the same between the two, but no, they're not exactly the same. And that is something to discuss, right? You've got a 4-year development difference between the two. Now, I admired VPN filter as a really interesting operation, but I will say something that gave us some sense of comfort in these devices that we have very little visibility into, like Soho routers, was the fact that these were hard-coded with specific paths, specific models. They were only meant to deploy in certain ways. That's not the same case with AcidRain, right? This is a start of trying to get attribution, but I think that something that we need to worry about with AcidRain is that it's precisely designed to be more generic. AcidRain, I don't even think that the developers necessarily had a copy of the firmware that was going to be in those Viasat modems. What they created was something that's just going to look for all the usual folders and the usual devices in one of these embedded Linux devices, and then just go and wipe everything that it could possibly find. So it's something to keep in mind in the sense that this is a reuse tool where VPN filter was not. And the question is, where are we going to see it again in the near future? So for those of you, I don't have a lot of time. I don't want to dig entirely into Q&A, but for those of you kind of keeping track on the map, right, we have all this great stuff under Sandworm now. There's still something in the unattributed column. There's ISAC Wiper. If folks are looking for something to kind of research, we still have no context around it. We don't know what threat actor is using it. We don't know where it's been deployed, why it's deployed, how, whatever. And it actually has one of the earlier compilation timestamps in this sort of conflict. If I remember correctly, it was November of last year. So, if you're looking for something to work on, that's a particularly interesting one. And something to keep in mind is, yes, we don't know exactly who those threat actors are, but also, where the hell are the threat actors that we have come to associate with Russia in general, right? APT28 is just doing phishing campaigns. Turla, Nobelium, or APT29 or whatever, I believe that there's some connections between some of those clusters and Nobelium, but the truth is that for the capabilities that we come to expect from the Russian ecosystem as a whole, not just the GRU, we are missing a lot of the picture, and I doubt that they're not involved in the Ukrainian conflict. So I'll just kind of try to wrap this up really quickly so we can at least have a couple of minutes for questions, but the horizon of what's possible, probable, and opportunistic is sort of this broad thing, and there's a certain amount of fear-mongering, and then there's, I think, a certain amount of sort of justified concern. One of them is sort of the ICS doomscape, right? They're coming, they're going to shut everything down, they're going to blow up the LNG facilities, we're all going to die, and that's fine. But I think that there's this other side of the house that we also need to be worried about, which is we have just sanctioned this country back to the Stone Age, and there's a playbook here that's already been kind of proven by the North Koreans, which is that one of the best ways to handle sanctions is actually just ransomware and stealing cryptocurrencies and doing all kinds of delightfully annoying things, and they have all the A players are sitting there, Conti and Trickbot and so on. So while I wish that this had nothing to do with the ICS folks, I think it's also been proven in the recent past that one of the easiest or quickest payoffs you're going to get is to hit an ICS vendor. So let's not fall entirely on the side of what's going to happen to SCADA. There's a lot of IT concern there as well. So I kind of rushed through that. There's a lot more there. There's a lot more sort of in the Ukrainian conflict that we're not seeing just yet, and I have a feeling that if we had this talk in 2 weeks, it would have to be something entirely different. But I hope that that's kind of enough of a wrap-up of what's happening there, and mostly the question marks that we still have for folks to have a sense of what's happening in Ukraine with Russian, Belarusian, Chinese activity. And if you feel up to it, jumping into the fight would be much appreciated by everybody involved. So with that, I don't know if folks have questions or if we should delve into something, but thank you.
Hi there. I had one question for you. So, with satellite modems handling both RF and IP, did they provide any details on the RF attack vector, or was it specifically through IP?
Are you referring to the Viasat Act?
Yes.
So this is where I have to place a giant disclaimer, which is The only people who know the full breadth of the attack are, well, Viasat, obviously, and their incident response team. And there's a certain amount of like necessary parallel reconstruction here, right? Like part of what happens within an incident response is you have that dreaded NDA, and it kind of buys you a lot of space that you maybe shouldn't necessarily have. But yeah, it's hard to know. They talk about sort of this DDoS side of it, which apparently did not include any kind of malware. It didn't include, we don't really know. They say like sort of legitimate commands for that as well. Then there's the pushing of the wiper, which just from having been able to recover this binary somewhere in the wild, my guess is that it just got pushed into some update staging mechanism and pushed normally. And I don't know, right? Like I don't know how else they spread. I don't know how else they managed to use some of these routers in the meantime, because even in their own scheduling of things, it looks a little wonky. But that's where I have to defer entirely to Viasat and their IR company, which, you know, I hope someday we just get like a full report of it. I'm sure they're doing a great job. It's more about like kind of clarifying an important statement in the midst of sort of this hot take jungle, right? Sorry? Yeah, I mean, at that point, it was really just sort of taking everybody offline, but obviously that didn't work out quite as intended if you're going to take down the remote control of sort of these wind turbines. And like I said, the only reason we knew about this attack was because of that. I'm sure this would have gotten shelved and lost in the midst of the conflict.
Hey Juan, how's it going?
How's it going?
Pretty good, nice work. More of a clarification item,
Sure.
Because the blog earlier noted the VPN filter connection, but that was before Cyclops Blink came out.
Yeah.
So the connection to Sandworm then is Cyclops Link to VPN filter similar to AcidRain?
Yes.
Okay.
And I'm right there with you. Like I've sort of kept delving into Cyclops Blink. Cyclops Blink looks like it was built in an entirely different sort of development environment. I don't know, like I think ESET has a much more granular sense of what these groups are supposed to be, whether you know, telebots and however you want to sort of separate these groups. There's definitely a completely different development paradigm as far as I can tell. And I mean, there's a reason we wanted to be, like, stay as far away from hyperbole as possible. Like, I don't think that that's enough of a link where you go sort of like whack them over the head. If this weren't in the midst of a war, I think we would have all been incredibly cautious about saying like this was Russia. But there is enough there, and we kind of kept scanning. Like, there's a few different ways that I want to take the code similarity, right? Like, we could talk about sort of unique code conventions and sort of go with that. So far, we haven't really pulled anything there. Then there's the other side of it, which is, well, okay, if they share, let's say, 55% of their same, code development, same compiler, same linker, can we take a bulk of that code and find what else is built in that way? And that's something that we've been working at. So far, the hits are just VPN filters, but it feels like a bit of confirmation bias, right? Like, there's definitely not enough of a library of, MIPS, ELFs just sort of sitting around where I would take that to the bank the way that I would with Windows. But, we're trying. We're trying to figure it out.
All right, cool. Thanks, man.
Anyone else? I think we're out of time. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. And, more than happy to chat after. Thanks.